एक सफर है सुहाना यहाँ कल क्या हो किसने जाना जिंदगी.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Jody Buchholz. I'm the manager of Local Immigration Partnership of Lanark and Renfrew County. I'm really pleased to be here to open today's event, the Expulsion of Asians in Uganda, reflecting on 50 years later, as part of our ongoing speaker series. So a little bit about Local Immigration Partnership. We aim to strengthen the role of local communities across Lanark and Renfrew counties in Ontario, Canada, in integrating and serving our newcomer population. Local immigration partnerships are funded by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, which is a department of the Government of Canada, and supports communities in bringing together service providers, settlement agencies, community groups, employers, and other key municipal organizations to create a welcoming and inclusive community for newcomers. Today's focus is important as what happened 50 years ago has had a lasting impact on not only the 80,000 refugees who experienced the trauma of banishment after dictator Idi Amin declared he would create what he called a pure Uganda, a country whose only citizens were Black like himself, but also on the current refugee pathways to many countries today. On August 4th, 1972, Idi Amin ordered the expulsion of an entire Asian population, giving them 90 days to leave Uganda. Thus began the nightmare of 80,000 Asians being mostly born in Uganda, holding Ugandan citizenship, and now were stateless. Before we welcome our speakers here today, I do, to take us further into this really important conversation, I want to acknowledge that Local Immigration Partnership of Lanark and Renfrew County is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. Local Immigration Partnership is working towards reconciliation, and this acknowledgement is just a small reminder of our larger commitment. With this in mind, we do respectfully thank these Indigenous peoples for hosting us on their ancestral lands. Miigwech, thank you. With those thoughts shared and a willingness to learn, let me properly introduce today's dynamic speakers. Noreen Nassim is a debut novelist, having released her father's memoir in May of 2021. Her father, Amir, is an expat from the 1972 Ugandan Asian expulsion, ordered by President Idi Amin. Writing wasn't always something that she had intended to pursue. Noreen has led a successful and ongoing career for over a decade in the field of further education as a lecturer, specializing in digital arts and creative media. After the success of her first debut novel, an Amazon bestseller, I should add, Expelled from Uganda, Noreen delivered her very first TEDx talk in Doncaster in October of 2021, focusing on the theme of positive disruptors. Such a great theme, where she discussed the role of positive disruption within the Ugandan Asian community, along with how it has shaped her own life choices. Welcome, Noreen. Author of Worth, a memoir written from a child's perspective growing up in Uganda and becoming aware of the various prejudices surrounding her birth and adoption, Bharti Dhir was found on the roadside in Uganda in Kabale. And it was reported that she was an Asian baby. It was then established that she was African Asian. Bharti was adopted by a Punjabi Sikh family and faced messages of racism, sexism, and prejudice surrounding the illegitimacy in the community. Her adoption was also a secret. Her book is about experiences we go through that bring our sense of worth up and those that bring our worth down. With the hope of inspiring people of all ages, Bharti wants all of her readers to know that despite the most unfortunate of beginnings, it is possible for all of us to claim our sense of worth within and not let our past or negative experience define our future in a negative way. Welcome, Bharti.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very honored to be here. Thank you.
And lastly, we have a career foreign service officer. Mike Malloy has 35 years of experience in international and refugee affairs and served in Japan, Lebanon, Minnesota, Geneva, Jordan twice, Syria, and Kenya. In 1972, he helped bring 6,000 Ugandan Asians to Canada. He led the implementation of the refugee provisions of the 1976 Immigration Act, including the refugee sponsorship program, that the designated classes, the WUSC student refugee program, and the annual refugee planning process. Between 1979 and 1980, he coordinated the resettlement of 60,000 Indo-Chinese refugees. He served as counselor for humanitarian efforts at the Canadian Mission in Geneva and managed immigration operations in Jordan, Syria, and East Africa. Following Director General level assignments in Ottawa and Toronto, he was appointed ambassador to Jordan from 1996 to 2000 and was special coordinator of the Middle East peace process from 2000 to 2003. As former president of the Canadian Immigration Historical Society, he initiated the establishment of the Ugandan Asian Online Archive at Carleton University's Library and Archives, and actually just finished a 3-day conference on this very topic. He co-authored a book called Running on Empty, Canada and the Indo-Chinese Refugees of 1975 to 1980. And he's currently coordinating the writing of a second book based on 180 oral histories collected from Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian refugees under the Heart of Freedom Project. Welcome, Mike. So Noreen, we're going to start with you today. Your father was one of the last to leave Uganda. What were the last days in Uganda like for him, having the paperwork to leave only a couple days before the 90-day deadline of November the 8th in 1972?
So obviously at that point, it was unknown territory, I think, up until the point where he'd actually received his paperwork, because up until that point, they just didn't know whether that paperwork would be ready in time. There was a lot of uncertainty that lay around the documentation. Will it be ready? Will it not? There were many trips that were taken to Kabale in order to get this paperwork ready. And if you weren't seen on the day, then you'd be sent away by the embassy. They would close their doors. So my father, luckily, he did very much near the end. He managed to get his documentation together. But again, with it being the very last sort of period of that 90-day expulsion order, times were very, very difficult. I think the country in itself had become very unsettled. There was a lot more violence towards the end in terms of businesses being looted, properties being taken over. Although, you know, there was this sort of 90-day, you know, sort of official period that was given, I don't think many people really stuck to that or looked at it as a period of full protection up until that point. I think people realized that we have to leave as soon as possible, because the nearer we get to that deadline, the worse things are going to get and the more disruption there is going to be. And perhaps it may get even more difficult, which it did. I think for many families, it became more and more difficult. Hence why many families did sort of leave within the first 8 weeks. But unfortunately, there were many people, I think there were a few that, you know, that few families that we know as well personally that actually didn't quite make it past that deadline. They ended up sort of staying a week or two over. But then they did manage to find safety, and they actually came to England and various other places in the world after the deadline. So for my father in particular, it was very difficult towards the end. He had his uncle with him. His family had all left by then. I think my grandfather's main concern was getting the women to safety. There was my auntie, my father's younger sister, his mother. I think they took priority, and my father understood that there were problems with my father's paperwork because he'd never travelled out of the country, whereas all his other siblings had done. So it put him in a very difficult position. But again, you know, those last few days, from what I gather, not just my father, I think there were so many other people that were in the same boat. They experienced a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges. And I think it was sort of quite heart-wrenching knowing that they were put in that situation, not knowing whether they were going to make that deadline. And then the threat of knowing, you know, that looming threat of what if we don't make it out? What will happen to us if we don't, you know, cross the border by that deadline? What could possibly happen? Because I think pretty much everybody knew what Amin was capable of and had seen examples of what he was capable of. So I think that in itself was quite a horrific time for many.
Now, you mentioned that there were a couple of families that you know of, that your family knows of, that did go beyond the 90 days. What was their experience like past the 90 days, and why did they make it so hard for Ugandans to leave?
So obviously the challenges that were put ahead in terms of, you know, leaving, there were so many. I think going to the embassy, trying to get paperwork together, there were unprecedented times. I think a lot of these systems and networks had never existed prior to this. And, you know, I think Mike can vouch when we say, you know, that these were, you know, times that we'd never passed through. We didn't really, there was no contingency plan in place. And I think when it came to things like medical records, vaccinations, accessing, you know, passports and things like that, there was no system in place. There was a lot of confusion, I think, as well. And it took a little bit of time just to get these systems into place so that people could then access them. So I think the initial shock of it took a couple of weeks, I think, for people to absorb and understand what was happening. And it took time for other countries to then put their systems into place, to send people abroad and say, right, we need to set up over here. We need to get, you know, people seen. We need systems in place that will allow us to, you know, sort of some sort of accountability for the sheer number of people that we're going to be dealing with. And so that's one of the challenges. The other challenge was getting to the airport, the amount of checkposts on the way, the amount of looting that took place at these checkposts. It wasn't easy. And there was no level of security that could potentially protect you in order for you to sort of get to the airport safely. You were on your own. Anything could happen between you traveling and arriving at the airport. And there were a number of checkposts. It wasn't just one or two. And they would all be manned by, soldiers. There were no rules. It was a corrupt bureaucratic system at the time. So anything could have gone wrong. Lots of things did go on. I hear so many stories of, horrific stories. And then we hear some stories of people quite, happily passing through these checkposts without any issue. So I think everybody's experiences varied at that point. So yes, it was very difficult. There were so many challenges getting there. But yeah, I think, overall, many people sort of look back and reflect on it was the fear factor that people remember. That's the bit that remains with them, when they sort of think about the journey to the airport, trying to get the paperwork in place. It's the fear factor that's remained. And I think it's the trauma of that has sort of remained unaddressed, I think, as well.
So your father was 19 years old when he lived through this. So what did this 19-year-old man's journey look like, leaving the only country that he knew?
I think for my father, it was at the time, every time I ask him this question, he gives me a mixture of different responses. And it's bittersweet in the sense that he was a little bit excited. There was this sense of excitement because he was young, and he thought to himself, my goodness, I've heard so much about England, this country where he's read novels of James Bond novels, he's watched movies, he's watched the Hollywood movies, and he sort of had this vision of what England would be like. So as a 19-year-old, he said there was this sense of excitement, but then, the bitter side was that he was leaving, he was being forced to leave his homeland. Everything that he knew was being torn away from under his feet. And I think he was the only one, I think, in his family, along with maybe a couple of the younger siblings, that felt this way. Whereas his older sibling and his parents were, they were absolutely mortified. They were in shock. They were absolutely sick to their core because they knew nothing else. They were at the age where they sort of thought, well, we're unable now to adapt. This is everything we know. And, it's not our age to be sort of uplifted, uprooted, and just sort of taken away from everything we know. So I think it was harder for my grandparents, whereas for my father as a 19-year-old, it was bittersweet. It was this balance of, I'm never going to see my homeland again, and everything that's happening is very frightening, but there was this certain little notion of hope that kept him going, knowing that there would be this new start, and a little sense of excitement as well.
Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned that your father and your uncle were kind of the last of your family unit to leave. How hard was it for them to reconnect with your family in Britain?
It was very difficult. So my father, sort of the moment they'd arrived on the camp, my father had actually been split up at the point when he caught his flight. The barrier went down, and unfortunately my uncle didn't manage to board the same flight. So then there was this fear of, am I going to see my uncle again? So he boarded his flight. Luckily, they actually did meet up at the same camp. There were so many different camps that were set up in the UK, and they were old barracks. They were all old deserted army barracks that were still standing, and they were sort of spread out around the UK, as far north as Scotland. And my father there was this moment where he was on the coach, and somebody turned to him and said, "Oh, which camp is it that your family might be at?" And my father had this look of horror, thinking, well, how many camps are there? Because to him, he was under the impression that there's this one big camp where everybody's going to be, and he's going to be reunited with his family. So that didn't happen. Obviously, he was at a different camp in Sussex, and then it took them at least a few months to actually reconnect, because back then, we didn't have things like mobile phones. There were telegram systems that were in place. And he explained that there was actually like a notice board where they had little names on these little cards that were pinned on these notice boards. And my father's surname as well, Majoti surname, was very, very common as well. There was quite a common surname. So it took them a while to reconnect. They would have to go to the reception, ask them, and say, we've seen this family name on the board. Can you ring this camp and see if it's our family? And that's how you would reconnect with people. So they were a third time lucky. They managed to find, my father managed to find his mother and father and the rest of the siblings. But that happened well within, I think it was about sort of 3 months after they'd arrived. So they were there for quite a while at the barracks before they met. And I think they were about an hour away. So then they were popped in a taxi, and then they made their way to the barracks, and they were reunited finally.
So roughly 3 months to get reconnected with the family. Beyond that, what was your father's experience like in Britain?
I think there was an adjustment period. I think there was a huge shock, I think, to the system, firstly, in terms of there was a cultural shock. I think that my father and perhaps siblings were a little bit more accustomed to how things were done, and they spoke English quite well. My grandparents struggled a little bit, but I think they managed to sort of get straight into work. They were very sort of work orientated people. They wanted to get straight into sort of either education or work. The first thing that my father and his brothers did were that they got straight into sort of part-time education and work. Their younger sister went straight into education. So they just wanted to sort of mix into society, integrate straight away, and get into working life. And they had no choice because it was very difficult. My grandmother, she brought her sewing machine with her. That was the one item that she brought, and she literally clutched it and didn't let go of this sewing machine, because that was the one skill that she had. She felt safe within that notion, knowing that this is something that I can do. I can contribute to the family if I sew. And that's what she started doing then from home. And but everybody sort of wanted to quickly integrate into society. It was difficult at first. I think there were incidents where they did experience a little bit of racism. They were sort of moved into sort of council housing, and there were the odd issues where I think neighbours, there was a little bit of animosity with some neighbours. However, there was other neighbours that were welcoming them with open arms, and they had wonderful experiences with them. So it was a real mixed bag, I think, in the beginning. But then as people got to know them and they sort of integrated into society, I think things got better. But I think it was just that fear of the unknown, possibly.
I open it up to Bharti and to Mike to comment on what Noreen has shared. Any kind of similarities in what you're hearing in your experience, Bharti?
I mean, a lot of what Noreen has just said is just, it resonates with me so much. You know, and I can really relate to that experience of the soldiers looting and taking what they can, and the sort of trauma of people not knowing whether they were going to make the end of their journey alive, or they were going to die on the way, or was somebody going to be taken from their family en route by the soldiers. So yeah, Noreen, it really resonates. The other thing that really resonates is this issue of racism. So when we came, we were placed in a council area. We weren't that fortunate enough to have neighbours who also welcomed us. We had real outright hostility in the road. And I think because my mum was a widow and with 5 children, people did see her as somebody who was going to depend on the state. I don't know whether families where there were men involved had it a bit easier, because people thought, well, they're going to go to work and they're not going to be depending on the state for benefits, and take, you know, everything without even paying taxes. So we had experiences of bricks thrown through our windows at night, through our bedroom windows, dog feces being put through our letterbox, graffiti on our walls and doors telling us to get out, that we weren't welcome here. And it culminated with them trying to set fire to the house, and that's how we got moved from that area. But yeah, we had horrific experiences where we had to stay awake. We had to all take it in turns, even though we were children, to stay awake during the night in case we were attacked. So yeah, it was a very harrowing experience. We had people from outside the camp, you know, English people and Indian people, who were very supportive and really looked out for us. And in fact, my mom was diabetic, and it was the consultant who wrote a really strongly worded letter saying that he would sue the council chiefs personally if anything happened to our family, because he could see how stressed my mom was. So, and then when the fire occurred, they decided to move us. But yeah, a lot of what you said, Noreen, really resonates. It's so moving to hear, and it's so lovely also in a heartfelt way to hear how your father coped with it. You know, I mean, I would agree that as children, we felt that excitement of going to another country. Yeah, so yeah.
Yes, I mean, that means so much to me. Thank you, because I think that sort of, it's very reassuring hearing that. Obviously, I was born here in the UK, and you know, in the 80s, and I think for me, my biggest challenge was trying to understand what actually happened. And I think when you've not been a part of it and you're understanding it from somebody else's perspective, it can be one of the hardest things. And I think my biggest challenge in writing my father's memoir was trying to really get under his skin and understand what happened, and also to understand it from a collective perspective as well. So hearing that from you really means a lot to me, because that just reassures me that I've managed to really get a little bit of that essence of what truly happened out there, because I can only describe it from what my understanding is, and it's one of the biggest challenges when you're writing a memoir on behalf of somebody else. So thank you very much.
And now, Bharti, you just shared some of your experiences in the camps. But you were also in a unique situation as an Asian African girl who was adopted by a Punjabi Sikh family. Can you tell us a little bit about the sexism and the racism that you experienced growing up in Uganda?
So I was born in a small town called Kabale, which is right down on the Rwandan Congo border. And the circumstances of where I was actually born are not known, because I was found on the roadside. And initially people thought, as you said earlier, that I was an Asian baby. And so lots of people came forward in the small community that there was in Kabale at the time. But then when they found out that I was actually part African, part Asian, then a lot of families dwindled away. My mother was quite spiritual in her own right, and she felt, well, she'd had a dream, essentially. She was carrying my sister at the time, and she'd had a dream that she was going to have another little girl joining the family. And so that in itself, when she told me the story when I was in my teens, you know, it's about her spirituality, her faith, and the fact that she really pushed my father that I want this. This is our girl. This is the child I was dreaming about, to the point that she even dreamt about the ward, which ward, what the ward number was, the hospital, what I would look like, that I was wrapped up in a pink blanket. And it was exactly as she dreamt when I eventually was found in the hospital, when they came to collect, well, they came to see me. My father just did it to humor my mom. My mother knew she was going to find me in that hospital. So this kind of racism and sexism I grew up with. So there is another part of the side of the whole Uganda expulsion, and that was partly due to the racism that the Asians exhibited towards the Africans. Mm. So there was like a real hierarchy, knowing, you know, when you grew up, you knew that there was this hierarchy. So you had the white people on top, you had the Asians in the middle, and you had the Africans on the bottom. So imagine as a dual African Asian child growing up with that sort of inherent message that you are not good enough because you are part African yourself. Not from my immediate family, I would say, but there were experiences of my relatives saying to my father and my mother, my adoptive mother and father, why are you adopting an African child? You know, you're bringing great dishonor onto the family. People are going to think that, you know, my father had had an affair. So then they were saying it's going to impact on the marriage prospects of our children. So my mum and my dad were actually shunned by some members of the extended family because they chose to go ahead and adopt me. So there was that level of racism. And then there was the colorism, you know, and I've written about it in my memoir called Worth. And I've said how, you know, I always compared myself to Asian and Western ideas of beauty because that's how I was brought up, and how I found myself wanting. And actually, for many years, I got lost in that sense. You know, my worth was lost when it came to my looks and what I believed of myself. So, so the colorism was there. I wasn't considered attractive enough. I had curly hair. I was dark skinned. And so you grow up with that message. And then there was the sexism, you know, where my family were told, my mum and dad were told, if you want to adopt a boy, because at least a boy will bring something into the family, something useful. Why are you adopting a girl? Mm. You know, who's only going to, you're only going to be marrying this girl off. And in fact, who's going to marry her? For a start, she's going to be a burden on you for the rest of your life because nobody's going to want her. So my journey is also just around the whole prejudice of illegitimacy, you know, like people really believed that when I would be at a certain age, I would do exactly what my birth mother did, which was have an illegitimate baby, which was it was really taboo in those times. It was frowned upon. And, you know, single mothers or mothers who got pregnant and weren't married were actually outcasted by the society, both Asian and African. So there was, you know, growing up with those sort of messages of prejudice about illegitimacy, about color, about sex, about race. That was essentially my experience from the outer community. And all of this was through not knowing I was adopted. So I knew that there were negative messages and I heard negative messages because people would talk right openly in front of me. And I could never make sense of it. But it was only when I found out I was adopted by going into my father's study and finding a file with my name on it. And it said Bharti. And I thought, whoa, that's a file about me. So I picked it up, read it, and discovered that I was adopted. You know, saw the letter about an Asian child being found on the roadside, etc. So yeah, so then everything sort of fell into place. And I think that was the beginning of my lack of self-worth, because I suddenly realized I wasn't who I was meant to be, because my father and my mother had always told me I looked like my father, my adoptive father. I was part of the family. And you know, my mother, many years later, explained to me that they never wanted me to feel that I was not part of the family. So that's why the adoption was hidden. And I think that was very common in the 60s, and probably before the 60s. Parents didn't share with their children that they were adopted. So, you know, now in my job as a child protection social worker, I do come across parents and grandparents who say, oh, I was adopted, but I was never told. Yeah.
So interestingly, though, Bharti, on the flip side of that, some within your community also celebrated you and saw you as being lucky. So how was the dichotomy between being told that you didn't have worth, and then also then being celebrated as being seen as a lucky person to be around?
I know it was a very confusing and it's a very confusing time, because there was certainly, you know, soon after my parents took me in, my father won the football pools. And there was a sect of the Hindu community who decided I was lucky. I was the goddess Lakshmi had brought me into this family, and therefore I was lucky. And so I used to have things like people would come and they'd ask me to touch their papers if they were going to buy a house, or you know, they'd say if somebody was pregnant, a woman was pregnant, she'd plead with my mum and say, oh, tell Bharti to touch my tummy. And then I'd touch the woman's belly, and then she'd say, is it a girl or is it a boy? And I knew dutifully I had to say it was a boy. Even though I didn't have a clue. My mum would say, just say it's a boy. And I said, it's a boy. And they'd go, oh, bless you, bless you. I got loads of sweets as a result. So there was that real dichotomy. On the one side, you know, people saying, oh, you know, she's ugly, she's dark, she's African. And then the other side, oh no, don't say anything negative because she's very lucky. She's going to bring us luck.
I can't even imagine what that constant push and pull that you were living with. So Bharti, when Idi Amin expelled Asians from Uganda and your family was forced to flee to the UK, your adoptive mother refused to follow the order. Can you share a little bit more about your mother's incredible courage?
Yeah. So basically, when in Kabale, we had the soldiers come in there because Kabale is on the Congo-Rwanda border, and Idi Amin decided that if there was going to be an invasion against him, it was going to be from Congo or Rwanda side. So in Kabale, what happened was there was about 45 Asian families. It's a small town, or you know, and they took away everybody's cars. My mum couldn't drive anyway. So there was only one man who I called Mr. M in my book. And he was a taxi driver and he was allowed to keep his car. So he decided that for those families that had no cars and weren't given back their cars, he would take us out of Kabale to Kampala, to the capital. And, you know, what Noreen said earlier about the checkpoints. So we left Kabale, which is literally a 4 to 5 hour journey. And every 50 miles, there was a checkpoint. So when we got to the first checkpoint, there was a it's quite harrowing actually. So I'll just warn you now. But there was a car in front of us, and there was a family of Asians there, and the soldiers told them to disembark. And so they disembarked, and but one of their children was disabled. I think he was around about 7-8 years old boy. And as they were taking their time taking him out. And first of all, the soldiers got irritated because there was a wheelchair on the rooftop of the car. So they threw the wheelchair down the hill. And then as soon as they managed to get this boy out, because it took a bit of time and they were getting very annoyed, they actually shot him in front of us. And, and that's what I was saying to Noreen earlier about people not really knowing whether they were actually going to ever make the end of their journey alive or have people taken away. So the context of that is we've just seen that happen, and the parents being forced to tell the soldiers that they'd done good, because the father had to say to the mother, don't scream, don't cry, because if you start screaming and crying, they're going to shoot all of us. So we're going to lose everybody. So the soldiers forced them to say that they'd done a good job, and the family left then. And then it was our turn. And as they were rifling through our belongings, we were out on the roadside. They'd found a couple of cents in my brother's trouser pocket, and it didn't take much for them to shoot on the basis that you were smuggling money out. And Idi Amin had said, you cannot take extra money out. And as they were rifling, they didn't find any more cents because they'd already said they were going to shoot my brother. And then one of the soldiers pointed his gun at my mother, and he just looked at me very dismissively and he said, leave her behind. She's one of us. She's not one of you. And my mother said, no, I'm not leaving her behind. And you can imagine that sort of heart-stopping moment. Maybe it was just a couple of minutes, but it felt like eternity. And he then cocked his trigger and he said, I'm telling you again, leave her behind. And my mum said, no, I can't leave her behind. She's mine. She's my daughter. And then he sort of like stepped forward and he said, I'm just telling you for the last time, leave her behind. And my mum just said, no, I'm not leaving her behind. And I remember looking at her thinking, he's gonna shoot her, or he's gonna shoot me, one of us. Because when he shot the disabled boy, he said, what use is he where you are going to the family? And when he looked at my mum, he turned around and he looked at me and he said, what use is she where she's going, where you're going? So that's that. And I thought, that's it, he's going to kill me now. That is his opening sentence, to kill me. But my mum stood her ground. And the third time he said, I'm ordering you for the final time. She said, no, I'm not leaving her behind. And he then, there was a pause, and then he put his gun down, and then he laughed and he said, I salute your courage, to my mum. So in my book, I've called that a mother's courage, because then again, there was another couple of incidents, harrowing incidents in the house where we were, in the flat where we were in Kampala, where another one of my cousins, my mum had gone to get her papers, and how we had to be prepared to go into the water tank. And I don't know where she got the reeds from, but she had reeds, and she said, you need to breathe through this. If the soldiers come knocking on the door, you all jump in the tank. Her children and us, her nieces and nephews, we'd be considered as. And she said, and I will knock on the water tank when it's safe for you to come out. So again, it's about the courage of women in those situations, that they're prepared to sort of sacrifice their lives for their children, and what the worth is for their children. And I think that for me was the epiphany moment, and when all the taunts I'd ever endured at school about my worth and what I was lacking, to really feel that love from my mother was just amazing.
Now, Noreen and Mike, I'm sure in your efforts, and in Mike in your work directly, and Noreen in your preparation for the book, I'm sure I'm sure you've probably heard maybe not exactly stories like Bharti's, because it is such a unique story, but other stories about the courage of mothers and the courage of families to make it through this awful, awful situation.
We saw a lot of courage. We saw a lot of more violence, I think, in the months we were there than I saw in the rest of my life. And I served in a lot of places where there was lots of violence. I never saw people killed, actually, until I was there. It was the capriciousness that struck us, that, you know, that somebody would just decide to shoot someone. I saw a man I could have reached, if it hadn't been for my window, I could have reached out and touched a man just as the police hit him on the head so hard he killed him. Another time I was having lunch with someone, and the police came in, and there was a journalist. They really went after all the Western journalists in the country, and they started shouting at him, and he had the temerity to shout back, and they hit him so hard they had to carry him out. So this was going on all the time. And then there was the famous day when after that little invasion from the south of the previous president's people, when a small convoy of military vehicles came down the street in front of us, and we got all the people waiting for us. We had lots of space, so we packed them in the office. And then, like idiots, we went and stood in the window, and this big armored vehicle and a bunch of jeeps, and they all had machine guns mounted on them, and they saw us, and they swung all the guns around, and we're standing there in the window. We had a World War II veteran on the team, and he just said, "Stand still, don't move, don't even move your hands, just stand still." And I can remember thinking, geez, I can't leave my wife at this stage. She's expecting a baby, you know. And then they started laughing among themselves. They swung the guns around and away they went. So there was, and we had another instance where we had 2 Sikh women that we'd hired to work with us. Daddy was a former big game hunter, quite a formidable man. And he was sitting on the back porch, I guess, with a couple of his friends having a beer one evening, and somebody, I don't know, it was 1 or 2 men came and said, "We're Army officers and we're taking over your house." Now, the deal was that the Army, the beneficiaries were going to be the Army. The cars and the houses and the businesses mainly went to Army officers. And a lot of the violence from the ordinary soldiers was that they weren't in on it. Anyways, this man obviously hadn't understood anything about dealing with Sikhs, because he quickly ended up in the trunk of the car, and they took him down to the local military base, and the Army questioned him, and they killed him right there in front of them. So we had this kind of continual taste of the violence. I mean, you know, we had diplomatic protection, whatever that is, but it won't stop a bullet, and it certainly didn't stop the occasional intrusion by soldiers into our office. I mean, we didn't suffer like the other people suffer, and we always had an escape possibility if worst came to worst. But we saw it all around it. We never doubted for 1 second the legitimacy of these people's need to get out of the country and have a solution.
Yeah.
It just was not. It never occurred to us that there was anything false about it. The evidence was all around us.
Yeah, it was.
Now, Mike, you helped bring 6,000 Ugandan Asians, like the families of Bharti and Noreen, to Canada. Can you share with us what your experience was like? You were there right at the inception.
Yeah. We had an office in Beirut that covered Eastern Africa and other places. And I'd been to Uganda twice that year while doing business in other countries, even though nobody was wanting to immigrate at that time, and heard things and saw things. I mean, I was sent to find out, you know, by my boss, who had this sense that trouble was coming. So I was there twice. I met a lot of people, some of whom are still friends to this day, heard things that really frightened me. and got back from the second trip just in time to read in the papers the August 4th announcement of expulsion. And there was it took a while for the people in our capital. The prime minister seized control of the issue, right? Trudeau said, I'll be setting the policy here, but still he had to bring cabinet along, and the bureaucrats had to figure out, so what are we going to do? The British actually, the British High Commissioner consulted with him, and the official reason, one of the official reasons, was that we were going to help the British. We'd had a long history of helping the British one way or another, various world wars and whatnot. But from the start, we had a feeling that there might be people who couldn't go to Britain. So anyways, I arrived on the 5th of August. The boss left about a week before. And just by his prodigious skill, by the time we got there, there was actually an office. And all I had to do was, literally the afternoon I arrived, is set it up. And we had lots of technical problems. I mean, the technology was a numbering stamp that allowed us to assign a number to a person and the file, and give the person the number so that they would know the file. And then we could just put the numbers in the paper and say, if you have these numbers, come for an interview, or if you have these numbers, come for your medical exam, or come pick up your visa. And that was a really very primitive, but really, really effective way of communicating with people and protecting their privacy and security at the same time. Because if we put out words saying so-and-so will be leaving, that would just draw attention to them. We were initially told that we were to use just ordinary, we had the point system at that stage. We were open up at this stage. This was the first large movement of people who were not Europeans who were going to be brought to Canada under the refugee envelope. So it was quite, it was a historic event, because it set a precedent that then rumbles down through Canadian refugee policy to this very day. We take refugees from where they are, not because of who they are or what color they are. The complications at the initial stage included a decision by the Ugandan government to expel Asians with Kenyan, Tanzanian, or Zambian passports. They were given 3 weeks to pack up and get out. And then they said all the Asians had cheated on their citizenship applications, and they were to bring their papers to prove their citizenship, and those were just willy-nilly taken away. Some people, it was confirmed, if you knew the clerk, or the clerk liked the look of you, or maybe you put a couple of bucks in the application, you might be confirmed, but the person next to you not. And in fact, one afternoon, the army came along, went down the line, and simply took people's documents away. That was it. That was the process. Put them in a bag and took them away. So the question of getting documentation became pretty complicated for those people. And it's important to understand as well that you had to also have proof that you paid your taxes before you were allowed to leave. And the office that did that, of course, had lineups for miles. And they weren't prepared for the number of people going. I mean, those were people going to Britain, and people going to Canada, and people going to India. They all had to go to this damn office and get a stamp saying they paid their taxes, and that backed things up. We had people miss their flights because they couldn't get that, and if they didn't have that, you didn't get through the airport. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there was this invasion from the south that made the place even more unsafe, because having been involved in the fighting, the soldiers just went wild, and it became more and more difficult. And people would come in and say, "We're not going home. If you don't take us, it doesn't matter, but we're not going back to Mbali or wherever we came from. We're not going on those roads again." It took a while but it didn't take very long. It took about six or seven days into the process, with continual reporting back to what we were seeing and what we were getting. The cabinet met again on the 13th of September, and the message after that was, this is a humanitarian operation. We didn't hear anything more about normal criteria. And this left us in a kind of having told us that, they didn't tell us anything more. So we had to figure it out ourselves. And the way it shook out roughly, and I do say roughly, because everything was fuzzy. And the thing that saved us is we had discretion to do what we thought best. But so the way it worked is this: the applications came in and my team looked at them. And since there were only about 20 occupations, it was very easy for us, knowing what the points were for these occupations, to quickly determine yes, 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 no, 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 no. If the answer was yes, and you had a Pakistani passport or an Indian passport or a British passport or a Ugandan passport, you were in, because you qualified under the normal immigration system. So there were lots of people, particularly families where the wife was a secretary. The husband could be, no, we don't care, but there was a high demand in Canada for secretaries. A lot of families just scooted through the system on that. So then the question is, who else do we take having done that? And once we reported to Ottawa on this citizenship verification debacle that took place, the answer came back before the day was out: treat them as if they were stateless. And the priority always went to stateless people. So you had these two axes. One is, do you actually really qualify? If so, we take you regardless of your citizenship. And the other axis was, whether you qualify or not, if you have nowhere else to go, come see us, because that's who we're interested in. Much less interested in people who had the ability to go to Britain. We thought, oh, the British are downstairs, they can deal with that. And so that's sort of the way it shook out. But we were grabbing people in need and people with talent as they went past. We thought, there's if this family's got something that we could see really being of value to Canada, we'll grab them. I remember one boy whose brother had been shot the day before. We got him on the plane the next day. And so it was dangerous and it was exhilarating. And we were very polite and jovial at the beginning. By week 8 or 9, we were getting a bit snappy, I have to admit, but not necessarily because we were annoyed at people asking us questions, but because we couldn't afford the time to stop and chat with you, because we're pushing people on, and we're beginning to get days when 2 airplanes come, and the odd day when 3 airplanes come. And we've got to make sure that they have their documents, that they know they're coming, that they know what they can take, that they know where to show up, they know which bus we're going to put them on, and when the flight will go up. We had a very young officer who'd arrived from London on his first posting with 2 months experience, and the boss put him in charge of everything behind me. His name was Jerry, and he ended up being an ambassador 3 or 4 times, a really talented guy. But at one stage, there were 3 flights, and one flight was delayed. Jerry went out and bought lunch for 200 people and just turned in the bill, and it was paid. That was that was the kind of empowerment that we had. And we were getting, there were all sorts of suggestions and pushing and whatnot from Ottawa, and of course the leaders of the different communities did everything they could to influence us, and occasionally that could become quite annoying. But I remember saying to at one stage, saying, they're doing their job. Their job is to push for their community. Our job is to have a process that we can look each other in the eye and say, we have integrity. And I never had a qualm about getting people who were really well qualified, and I never had any qualms about taking, if there was a disability in the family, they were in. Any kind of disability, you're in. If I can tell a quick story, this is the most interesting interview I ever did. Second week of October, we're really cooking. And we've been reinforced. We've got more officers, we've got more doctors, we've got more secretaries, and all these things. We're cooking along. The systems are working. And I'm on the 3rd or 4th interview of the morning, and the man who was in charge of the reception desk, big tough guy from the immigration department, had been torpedoed twice in 24 hours in the North Atlantic in the Second World War. and survived because the broken collarbone wouldn't let him pass out. Okay, one tough hombre. And he comes to me, and he sort of leans over my shoulder and he said, "There's somebody you got to see right away." And I was going to tell him, "Push off, I'm busy." And I looked at him. He had a red face like mine, but it was white, absolutely white. All the blood drained out. I thought, holy crow. I said, "Okay." And I turned the guy I was interviewing over to somebody else, and he comes back, and he's got a very tall, well-built Ugandan policeman with him, with a khaki outfit, shorts, shiny boots, blue hat, World War II ribbons, and a submachine gun in one hand, and a chain in the other hand. And on the end of the chain was a man in handcuffs, who said to me, he croaked and he matted hair. It looked like he'd been sleeping in his clothes, because he had. And he hands me this piece of paper, which I recognize as the stuff we put the stamp on, the number on. He said, "You called my number." So I said to the policeman, "Okay, please take off the handcuffs." He said, "No, you can't do that." So I put the chairs, I had the two chairs be like this. I put him in the back chair, put the man in the front chair, and we talked over. And the story was really very simple. His wife had a Kenyan passport, so they had to get her out of the country. He took her to the border. Of course, they shook her down and discovered she was taking her jewelry. They pushed her across the border, and they charged him with smuggling. Took this up, and he had been in jail for 5 days. His family tried to spring him. No way. He's been smuggling. And that morning, they'd opened the Argus, and there was his number. There was his number from the Canadian embassy saying, "Come for an interview." And so they rushed to the jail, showed it to the warden. They brought the guy up, and somehow or other, he was in a cell with 100 other people. He said, you couldn't lie down. He said you had to sleep standing up. He said that but he produced this piece of paper. Somehow or other, he'd managed to save that. So he arrives with this cop, with this bloody machine gun. And I knew, I'm a boy born in the Second World War. I know about all these guns, and this particular one was notorious because it had a habit of going off when it wasn't asked to do so. And he kept putting it on the floor and then picking it up, which, anyways, I have to, there's no way this fellow is going to be refused under no bloody circumstances. But I still have to do the paperwork, and he's an auto mechanic, which is the highest rating on the point system, speaks good English, pretty good character, having got his wife out, and has an auntie somewhere in Canada. So get all that done. And I say to the cop, "We've got to take it. He has to have a medical now." So we get up and walk across. The office was just dead silent. There's all these people, nobody's talking, just this dead silent. Go over to see the doctor, the chief doctor, who happened to be standing by his little booth. And we wouldn't always getting along with him. And I explained the situation, and Dr. Pichet says to the policeman, "Please take the chains off." "No, sir, can't do that." So he opens the curtains. They step in, close the curtains. There's the chains underneath the curtain, which occasionally moves. And so I'm standing there with this policeman. I realize he has 2 of the ribbons my father had. They were all with the British Empire in the war. And so I said, my dad has those. He got it in the North Line. Well, I got it he'd been in Burma, in the Burma campaign. So there wasn't much to talk about, but that gave us a little shred of common identity. And eventually, not very long later, the curtain opens up. Dr. Pichet comes out with a man, and he says to me, he's passed his medical. And I'm thinking, but what about the stool test? What about the x-ray? What about and he leans over to me and he says, "He's passed his medical, Michael." I almost kissed him. And then the boss shows up, Mr. St. Vincent, and he's wearing a military cut safari suit. Plants himself. He's a fighter pilot. Plants himself right in front of the sergeant, and in a very military voice says, "This man is to be at the airport tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock precisely. Is that understood, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "Well, make it so." And he turns and walks away like this, and the sergeant salutes. And then Dr. Pichet says to the policeman, if this works well tomorrow, you can bring your family for a medical examination the day after tomorrow. Well, big smiles. And we got him on the plane the next day. So that was a bit extreme, partly because of the machine gun, but it was not extreme in terms of our ability to spot trouble and get people on airplanes, because they were coming. Once we got to the middle of October, they were coming every day, like 31 in all, and sometimes 2 days. So it took a hell of an effort, and there were times when we were really frightened, and there were times when we were really sad. But we used to go dancing at night at the Leopard's Lair, where there was a hot Congolese band, and the beer was good, and the company was good, and we had incredible confidence in the boss. When, you know, he pulled the ideas out of our heads. When we used to, he had what we used to call the black label management system, where at the end of the day, those of us section heads would go to his place. The us younger guys would sit on the floor, the older guys would sit on the chairs, and he would open a 40-ouncer of black label and pass it around, and we'd talk the day through, and we'd talk about the problems, and then he'd say, so how do we solve that problem? And if we had the solution, that was it. If we didn't have the solution, he would give us the solution. So, you know, so we had tremendous confidence in him. We didn't necessarily have confidence in what we were being told by Ottawa, because they were forever misunderstanding things or not reporting things properly. But our little ship was sailing the way we thought it should sail, and whatever else was happening, we were going to live with it. So at the end of the day, we issued 6,175 visa. Over 4,000 people went on the charters. And when they got to Montreal, they were greeted with people with blankets and all sorts of things to make sure that they were warm, because they were coming in the fall. We eventually had to tell people to say, put socks in your pockets before you go. You know, coming off planes in November in Canada, you know, so always carry socks in your pocket. So you keep your feet warm. And they were, as I said in our earlier conversation, the military cooks got in touch with the Maharaja restaurant. There were very few Indian restaurants in Canada at the time, and they got rave reviews from the Asians themselves with the quality and flavor of what they were doing. So it was a really, really important. If you want to look at the long-term consequences, of course, the community itself, the people, because they spoke English, because they had city and guilds qualifications, because they were enterprising, and because they took their institutions with them. I mean, after the first flight arrived in Canada, later that same week, we got a telegram from the Canada Manpower Center in Vancouver saying, guess what? The Kampala Rotary Club just had its first meeting in Vancouver. And I remember one of the guys saying, well, cripes, if they're taking the Rotary Club with them, I guess we shouldn't worry about how these people are going to do. That's not to say that they still don't grieve. But on the other hand, at least for the Ismailis, I think for the Goans, because they were Christians, they could immediately go to Catholic churches, and they were in some ways more westernized. But with the Ismailis, I guess it was a few years after they arrived, the Aga Khan came to Canada. And a lot of them were still thinking, well, are we here? Are we not? And he said, this is your home now. This is your home. Canada is where you're home. And I think for a lot of the people in that community, that gave them permission to put down roots. But the other, if I just say the other thing is, 4 years later, I find myself back in Ottawa designing a new resettlement system because there's a new law. And almost everything we did in terms of designing a new resettlement system was because of things that either worked well or didn't work well. I just had such confidence because I could imagine, as we were doing this, how this would work, how this how this had worked or how this had not worked, and we weren't going to go back there. Like the first thing I did is get rid of the point system. We can look at the person and figure out how they're going to do, but we don't want to do numbers about it. We want to look at it holistically and focus on the refugee aspect rather than the resettlement aspect. So anyways.
Thank you so much for offering that, the three of you. So I have started to see some questions really flood in. So I think thank you so much for your insight and your candor. And I think it's safe to say that you've left us with a considerable amount to reflect on here today as we move into our Q&A portion of the session. So our first question is for Noreen. Noreen, you, in 1972, UK was not friendly towards Asians. And 50 years later, the Prime Minister, your new Prime Minister, is Asian born in the UK, but his parents are from Tanzania and Kenya. What are your thoughts on this? And will it make a difference in the attitude of UK folks towards race and color?
Interesting question. Yes, we are at quite a pivotal moment at the moment, and it's very interesting. I never thought that during my time I would ever see a prime minister, especially from East African Asian roots. So it is very. I think it's an exciting time. I'm optimistic rather than pessimistic. I'm optimistic to see how attitudes do change. I think I'm also very keen to see what Rishi Sunak actually does. I think it's all in the actions. This is the thing with prime ministers. They do come and go quite regularly here in the UK at the moment, and and there's ongoing jokes about that. But I think I would like to see what actions come forth from the promises that are made, because I think, again, change is within the actions themselves, and I think there is so much work to be done, especially when it comes to the immigration front and when it comes to handling sort of the refugee crisis. So I am very keen to see what becomes of it, and the kind of things that take priority as well within that front. I hope that some of the plans that had previously been put on the media about Rwanda being a central point for refugees being sent and things like that, I really hope that doesn't go ahead, because I think it would be heartbreaking, I think, in a sense, to know that at a time in 1972 when the refugees sort of fleeing Africa really needed that help, they were giving help, they were given so much. Mike's told us a story sort of from the Canadian perspective as to the kind of provisions that were being put in place, the kindness, the loyalty, that sort of real human essence coming to the surface when it comes to helping another human being. So I think it would be a shame, if we lost that 50 years on, because at the end of the day, we shouldn't be looking at people's race, religion, color, or where they're coming from. Refugees are refugees. They are humans. They're in need of help. And that is the only criteria that should be looked at. So I really hope that we see good things. Again, I'm optimistic. The pessimism within me does surface sometimes, I'll be honest with you, but I am quite optimistic. I'm really hoping that things do settle. I think perhaps it could only help having a person of colour at number 10 Downing Street. I'm hoping so very, very much. And I hope I'm not disappointed.
Our next question is for Bharti. How do you identify, it's a two-part question, I should preface. How do you identify yourself culturally? And what are your thoughts on colorism and how it's viewed today?
Culturally, I identify myself as a Punjabi because I speak Punjabi fluently. I've been brought up in the Asian culture, Indian culture, so I will dress sometimes in my Indian clothing. So culturally, in every aspect, because of the way I've been brought up, I'm Punjabi. From a racial perspective, I would say I consider myself African Asian. So there is when I was younger, I used to have my hair braided, and I used to embrace the African part of me, and I still do. So yeah, I culturally I'm Asian, but racially I'm part African and part Asian. So that's that, I hope that helps. The second part of the question was relating to
your thoughts on colorism and how it's viewed today. And we can open that up to the rest of the panel as well.
well, from my perspective, I do think there has been some improvement in the way people, I think that, but I'm talking about it from the Indian community. It's not as prevalent as it used to be, but there's still a lot of prejudice regarding people who are darker skinned.
Mm-hmm.
And although nowadays I see more interracial marriages, for example, or partnerships, you don't see, you see very few between African and Asian, although they are coming to the fore now, which is really refreshing to see. I just feel we've got a long way to go. The whole society, both white and black, because you get this in Africa, you get this in African Caribbean countries as well.
Mm-hmm.
I've had people come to me since my book was published. You know, I've had African women say to me, African Caribbean women say to me that they've experienced colorism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a historical colonial thing.
Mm-hmm.
The fairer you are, the more privileged, the more beautiful, the more luckier you're perceived to be. The darker you are, you don't have any of those benefits or those attributes. So I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of colorism. We need to see more portrayal of black skin in media, and black skin being beautiful, not just in media, black media outlets such as black magazines. We need to see it in the mainstream magazines. You still find that in media itself and in magazines and in books, the fairer you are, you're still considered to be more beautiful.
Now, Noreen, with your background, what are your thoughts, digital arts and creative media? I see you're nodding quite a bit. What are your thoughts on colorism?
I mean, I agree with everything Bharti's just said. I think, culturally, I've even experienced colorism as well growing up. I remember my first sort of incident where, or experience of it was that we had a very distant relative. I was about age maybe 7 or 8 at the time. And, there was this not so nice lady that had sort of come over. She was a very distant cousin of my mother's. And she'd held up my hand. I was sort of playing and she'd sort of grabbed hold of my wrist and she looked at my arm and she made a comment to my mother and said, well, she's very dark, isn't she? Do you not scrub her enough? You need to make sure that you use the right products because otherwise who's going to marry you when she's older? And I remember sort of having a little bit of a shock thinking, what is she talking about? And I had no sort of idea or, I'd never sort of thought of myself as, a colour was something that wasn't even on my radar. And I remember looking at my arm afterwards and looking at my skin and thinking, what did she mean by that?
Yeah.
And obviously I've had so many experiences, even, throughout high school, throughout, even college. I had instances of, bullying where, amongst the Asian community for being sort of a darker shade, and I was sort of mocked. I was called undesirable. I was called ugly because I was a lot darker in my shade. And yeah, I think it does have an effect on you. And I remember sort of crying to my mother quite regularly saying, Mum, why is, because my brother's a lot more fairer than I am. And I used to sort of, say to my mum, why is he fair and why am I so dark? And it used to affect me. And I used to think to myself, why am I like this? And, my mother was so, she was very patient with me. And she would sort of say, Noreen, colour means nothing. You are everything that you are, your personality, the beauty within you, that is all that matters. And I would sort of cry and say, well, what did Auntie so-and-so mean when she said nobody's going to marry me because I'm this colour? And and she would say, nobody's going to marry you for your colour. The person that marries you will marry you for your heart. And at the time, it didn't sink in. The penny just didn't sink in because you don't understand at that point. Initially, you as a child, you've sort of experienced somebody picking a fault within you, and immediately you sort of think, well, this is an adult saying that there's something wrong with me, so there must be something wrong with me. And it's very dangerous because you start adopting that label at a very early age. That label then takes over your thinking. It then starts affecting your mental health. It starts affecting, like Bharti says, your confidence, your self-esteem, the way you see yourself. And, you know, sort of now, you know, as a lecturer of the digital industries, I'm sort of teaching young 16 to 18-year-olds how to use Photoshop, how to use all of these programs. And the first topic we cover is self-confidence and the way that the media portrays beauty. Because the way it's portrayed, they've got it all wrong. And I go through a series of different lectures showing them, because that is the target audience. Unfortunately, they are the most vulnerable target audience at age 16, worried about the way they look, their image, you know, their proportions, their skin color, their hair, everything. It's just a constant worry for that age group. So the first thing we do is we cover that, and I show them examples of before and after images of how beauty is actually a distorted perspective within the media. So I empower them. That is the first thing I do. I empower them and show them that, look, it is software that is creating this. Your image of beauty is completely distorted. Let's have a reality check, and let's just show you the reality of how this is actually created. Because you're the next generation that's going to go ahead. The power is going to be within your hands to then reveal this to the world and say, look, you know, beauty is not the standards that we set within society, that we set within software programs. Beauty comes from within. Beauty is, you know, human kindness, human essence. It's, you know, it's compassion. That is where beauty lies. It's communication, it's openness. So that is the first thing that I cover with students. And it's wonderful because there's this real change in mindset. They look at social media differently, and they're immediately empowered, and they understand perspective better. And I think collectively that's a job that, you know, it's all of our jobs really, to take that on board and teach the younger generation that, you know, colorism, I mean, racism, all of it, it needs to be eradicated, because at the end of the day, these are all labels, and how we treat labels, you know, we've just got to be very careful, it's a very delicate matter as to how labels should be applied, and how appropriately they should be applied as well.
Thank you for that. Mike, the next question is for you. What impact have the experience of Ugandan Asians had on refugees today?
That is a very big question.
Yes.
I don't know that it has much of an impact on refugees today per se, but it has had 50 years on a lingering and profound impact on the approaches we take to refugees, and the systems, and the whole way our resettlement system works. Has its roots in what we learned in Uganda. First of all, the idea of separating out in our minds the notion of this is an immigrant, this is a refugee. We can't treat the two of them the same because they have different needs. With the immigrant, we're looking at they're coming for economic reasons. So what's the match? Are they coming at the right time for that occupation? Can we see them doing that? And I guess the thing that gives me a lot of pleasure is that over time, even with the current settlement system, which I don't understand very well, I must admit, the focus has gone away from how well will they settle to how big is their need. And that's been permitted by the fact that we have now, at the present time, in this country, we have 550, as you know, settlement agencies, RAP agencies, settlement agencies, and they are the best in the world, without any question. And their ability to adapt rapidly and deal with what's coming off the airplane and find solutions for people is unrivaled. It's never been as effective as it is today. And that's largely because the government took a decision after the Indo-Chinese movement that the system had to be put in the hands of not-for-profit organizations rather than bureaucracy, because bureaucracy can't adapt as quickly. You have to have the people in the communities who are dealing with the incoming people empowered and resourced to deal with what's coming at them, and empowered to make the decisions that have to be made for that family or that group of people. The government systems we had before, with good people in them, they worked very hard and all that sort of stuff, but you couldn't adapt simply because of the nature of bureaucracy. So I think that the big thing that the Asians from Uganda did was to prove to the public that a group of people who were mainly Muslim and not white could arrive in this country and within very short period of time not only be settled but be contributing. And we were lucky with that group because so many of those communities that came had a very strong public service element. They were very, very much business-oriented people, good, strong, capable people who had a kind of business aptitude that I only wish I had. But they also had this sense of service in the community and service outside the community. And it was remarkable how quickly that attribute that they brought with them impacted on was noticed. Now today there are spectacular examples of Asian business people buying hospitals and all sorts of other things, but it was the turning up for the annual charity events and doing things at the community level that actually were much more important at the end of the day. So that they pried the door open. And 7 years later, 60,000 Indo-Chinese refugees who hardly spoke English at all, who arrived with less and who'd gone through a hell of a lot worse experiences for sure, particularly the Cambodians, but all of them had gone through so much more in the way of actual physical trauma. We wouldn't have been able to deal with them and do it on the numbers if we hadn't applied the lessons learned in Uganda to the redesign of our settlement system and the importance of getting the citizenry involved, because it's society at the end of the day that has to absorb these people, not the government. The government can't do it. So all that's part of the legacy of Uganda. Mm-hmm. Now, it got obscured for many years because the Indochina thing was so big and so many people had jumped, 7,000 groups were formed to sponsor the Indo-Chinese refugees. So it became the model, but behind that model was what we learned in Uganda and what we applied to when we redesigned things. So right down to this day, people benefit from that.
Mm-hmm. Next up, we're going to ask Khalid to either verbalize their question. So you'll just have to unmute yourself, Khalid.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I am Khalid Bidi, and I'm calling in from Uganda. And I have a couple of questions, but I will be very, very brief. One specific question will go to Bharti. I greet you very much, Bharti. I grew up in Jinja on the partly in Kampala, but I know Toro. You look to be very lucky that your parents accepted you and moved with you to Canada. In Uganda, I grew up with very, very, very many African Asian children, and they were abandoned by their Asian fathers up to today. Some went ahead even to trace their fathers where they are in Canada, in UK, and in India, but they refused to accept them. How come you were so lucky that your parents accepted you? have you taken interest to research on all these Ugandan or African Asian children and probably write something about them like you have wrote your own book? My other question is, I have read a lot of books and a lot of stories about Asian injustice they suffered in Uganda. But there is something which is always missing. According to UN records and some archives here now in Great Britain, United Kingdom, it is alleged that Idi Amin compensated all Asians who were expelled from Uganda for their lost property. But most Asians came back to Uganda and reclaimed those properties. I just want, maybe you would take some interest, my sisters, to look into that one also. I also briefly want to maybe talk about one other thing. Could we say that Asian Africa, because they were not only expelled from Uganda, I think, some were also expelled from Kenya, others from Tanzania. Could we say that really, although Asians were victims of Amin, they were more of victims of Great Britain and the way they probably treated them? In fact, to go back to Bharti, I want also to say that maybe to inform you that some people allege, because I am young, I was not there, allege that one of the reasons Amin was annoyed with most Asians is that Asians never wanted to integrate with Africans. And that is the exact reason they abandoned their own children we have here in Uganda. And that's also formed part of the reason why Amin got annoyed with them, because there was also allegation that he wanted to marry an Asian woman and this woman refused, and that one contributed to that confusion. Thank you very much for your time. And I was a bit late in your meeting. I hope I've not misfired and asked questions out of the topic. Otherwise, I wish you a very good, it is already night here. I don't know, maybe there it is still morning or what. I wish you all the best, Mike and Nazim. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you, Khalid.
So, gosh, that was
Lots to unpack there.
unpacked there, and I can't answer everything, Khalid, but I will just say that you're giving me an idea for my next book then, in terms of an interest in African Asians in Uganda. And if I take your last point, yes, there were many. I know as an adult now that there were African Asian interracial relationships, and that there were Asian men who had affairs with African women and had children by them. And I know that didn't accept the children. They were largely kept secret from the society. So I think when my father adopted me, that was one of the things that was thrown at him, that people would assume he'd had an affair, and I was one of the children in that affair, that was born out of that affair. And in fact, my mother was told, used to often hear people say, oh, you're so good accepting your husband's offspring by another woman. So yeah, I can, so my mom grew up having to defend not just me, but also her husband, and to try and explain, no, this child was adopted because she was found on the roadside. So we decided to adopt her. And so I think I do consider myself to be very, very, very blessed, because I had an incredible upbringing. Yes, there were, in Uganda, there were child discipline issues. We all had them. But generally, I think my life was probably far more fortunate than maybe some of the children who were born of interracial marriage relationships. So I do consider myself to be very, very lucky, and I also consider myself to be very blessed that I had a mum who was so courageous and who said, I'm not leaving my daughter behind. So I've come to England. People used to say to my mum, you brought your servant over from Uganda. How good are you? And my mum used to say, no, she's my daughter. And they go, no, you brought your servant. Oh, you consider your servant your daughter. God's really going to bless you. So, you know, you grow up with those sort of messages. But yeah, I do consider myself to be very, very blessed to be where I am, and to be where, in a way, I think Idi Amin did many women and girls a favor, because I do talk to some of my friends and we all wonder, where would we have been if we weren't in the UK now, or in Canada, or, you know, in a Western country? We've been given opportunities that we may not have had in Uganda. You know, the norm was you got married and that was it. In relation to that bit about the integration, yes, it's true. Idi Amin did say that the Asians consider themselves to be higher. They refuse to marry us. And the story behind the Asian woman he wanted to marry, yes, it's documented. It was on BBC Two. There was a very rich family called the Madhwani family. He went there for dinner. He took a liking to one of the daughters-in-law and said, I want to marry her. And when it was explained she was already married, he refused to accept it. So he was essentially tricked by the Madhwanis, and they said, okay, come back in 2 weeks' time. We have certain rituals to follow and you can marry. Because they knew, Mr. Madhwani knew that if he refused, the whole family could be killed. 2 weeks later, when Idi Amin propped up with his army or soldiers and his family to what he thought was going to be his wedding, he heard that the whole family had fled on their private jets. And the story is that he was so enraged by it that he gave this, he said, and it's a keynote in his speech when he's expelling the Asians, he's saying, they refuse to marry us. They refuse to integrate with us. They think they are more superior than us. So I think that is a very important point to note, that, you know, I do wonder sometimes if he had got married to Mumtaz Madhwani, who is the lady in question, would he have given that edict? But he was such a volatile, unpredictable man. You do not know where the future held. I mean, we have to remember he killed some of his wives. He killed some of his children. So who knows what her fate would have been if she'd got married to him, especially if he still was determined to expel the Asians. So yeah, that's well documented about his view about the Asians exploiting, but also not integrating and not having relationships and marriages with African people. I don't know anything about the UN records and Idi Amin compensating people for their lost property. I don't think it happened, but that's just me. I don't know the history. Maybe Mike might be able to shed a light, or Noreen, but I don't know anything about compensation. Okay.
And oh, yep, go ahead, Mike. And then
Yes,
this will be the final thoughts, and then
okay.
we'll close off the session today.
Well, just very, very quickly, Idi Amin didn't compensate anybody for anything, but when the Museveni government took over, one of the earliest things they did was to agree that people would be compensated. And a lot of people did go back and reclaim their properties and then sell them. The process is not even fully complete at this stage, but current Uganda is unique in that it did set up a compensation mechanism which had results, and it did reach out to the Asians, and the official, when you talk to Ugandan ambassadors, they regard the Ugandan Asians as their brothers and sisters. At a rhetorical level, they're forever talking about like the High Commissioner in Canada considers the Asian community here part of her parish, along with the African Ugandans. So there's been quite a remarkable. It does contemporary Uganda a lot of credit because most countries that expel refugees never bother to reach out to them, never bother to reconcile with them. And there's been a real effort on the part of Uganda to do so.
Thank you for that insight, Mike. And I know that we could talk. I know that this conversation could continue on. I know that I could listen to you three all day long, but I do want to be respectful of your time and that you've given us this opportunity. So before we do close our speaker series sessions today, again, I just want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Noreen, Bharti and Mike, for your time and your outstanding talk. I'd also like to thank Suli Adams for recommending that we give this anniversary the attention it deserves and for securing and recommending some of our panelists here today. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today and to continue to support our speaker series. So thank you, merci, mugwech.
एक सफर है सुहाना यहाँ कल क्या हो किसने जाना हाँ जिंदगी एक सफर है सुहाना